The queen was dying and the planet was dying with her. Oceans swelled against their shores. Orbital rings trembled out of alignment. And an empire quietly calculated the cost of its own collapse. Ancient power was failing, sacred bonds were unraveling, and just as the last hope seemed to flicker out, the one being one trusted stepped forward, a human, with no royal lineage, no planetary birthright, only an inconvenient compassion and a refusal to stand aside. What followed was not just a miracle of survival, but the moment an empire learned that strength does not come from standing alone. The day the empire began rehearsing its own funeral, no one announced it aloud. They did not need to. The air itself seemed to carry the knowledge, passing it from corridor to corridor, through vaulted chambers of living crystal, and along the quiet currents of suspended transit lanes. At the center of it all lay Queen Althea, her pulse threaded into the planet's core like a luminous root slowly withdrawing from the soil. She looked as she always had, deceptively human in form, with the calm geometry of a woman accustomed to command, but her skin, usually a vibrant royal purple, had dulled to the faint shade of a fading nebula. Her long ears, elegant and finely tapered, rested motionless against her blonde hair. Those ears had once turned like precise instruments toward whispers of dissent. Now they lay still, as if listening for something that refused to answer. Around her the harmonic lattice shimmered, a suspended architecture of bioquantum filaments translating her neural rhythms into planetary stability. It flickered at irregular intervals. Each flicker rippled outward. Oceans shifted uneasily. Atmospheric regulators recalibrated with nervous hesitation. Somewhere in the northern hemisphere, a ring of orbital mirrors lost synchronization and began projecting sunrise in the middle of the night, which would have been poetic if it were not catastrophic. The High Council assembled in a crescent around the chamber, their robes whispered against the polished floor, their ears shorter than the Queen's, but equally expressive, tilted with restrained alarm. None dared speak the obvious. If her bond failed, the planet's tectonic heart would drift out of phase, continents would tremble, satellites would wander like distracted children. She is withdrawing, murmured Counselor Vyerth, her voice tight. The planetary resonance no longer answers her. She is not withdrawing, replied Counselor Mailer. The resonance is failing her. That is a distinction without comfort. At the periphery of the chamber stood Elias Mar, who had been invited only because every other option had exhausted itself in dignified disappointment. He kept his hands folded behind his back in what he hoped was a posture of competence. It might have been mistaken for mild confusion. Humans had been on the planet for 12 years, long enough to build embassies, not long enough to be trusted with anything more volatile than cultural festivals. Elias had attended many of those festivals. He had once tried to explain stand-up comedy to an audience that interpreted sarcasm as a medical condition. He watched the lattice flicker again. He had spent years studying it, not the ceremonial explanations offered public archives, but the deeper architecture, the bioquantum reciprocity, the neural entanglement between sovereign and world. The Queen did not merely rule, she harmonized, and harmony, he suspected, required more than authority. Her cortical emissions are diminishing, said a technologist from the lower tier. At current decline, the bond will sever. Within 2 planetary rotations. Silence followed that felt almost respectful. Elias cleared his throat. It was not a dramatic sound, but in that chamber it might as well have been a meteor impact. Several counselors turned toward him with expressions typically reserved for malfunctioning devices. Yes, said Mailer carefully in the tone one uses before regretting the question. I would like to try something, Elias said. Virth's ears angled back. You are a xenobiologist, not a symbiotic sovereign. True. Elias agreed. I'm also structurally fragile and emotionally transparent. I've read the reports. This is not a moment for humor. It rarely is, he replied gently, and yet humor persists. That may be relevant, the counsel did not look persuaded. He stepped closer to the lattice. The biocrystal hummed, faintly attuned to a frequency beyond conventional instrumentation. Within it, Althea floated in a suspension field, her body supported by arcs of pale light. Her face was serene, but the serenity felt forced, like a diplomat maintaining composure while the building burns. I believe the bond is not failing from weakness, Elias said. It is destabilizing from isolation. The symbiosis has become unilateral. She carries the planetary field alone. She has always carried it alone. Mailer replied. Yes, Elias said, and perhaps that is the flaw. A murmur moved through the chamber. The bond is described as sacred, he continued, but in structural terms it is an exchange of harmonics, input and response. If her neural field no longer receives adaptive feedback, it will dampen. You propose to provide that feedback, Virith asked. Incredulous, I propose to attempt it. I've constructed an interface. He hesitated. It is modest. Define modest. It has only malfunctioned twice. That earned him several looks of profound despair before the council could formally forbid him. The lattice flickered again, this time violently. The chamber lights dimmed. Somewhere beyond the capital, thunder rolled. Across a clear sky, Mailer exhaled. Slowly, proceed, he said, as though granting permission for a controlled explosion. Elias activated the device at his wrist. A thin array unfolded, projecting a lattice of its own. Simpler, less ornate, but mathematically aligned with the Queen's frequency. He placed his hand against the biocrystal. It was warm, almost alive. Your Majesty, he said quietly, uncertain whether she could hear him, this is the part where I either become a historical footnote or a cautionary tale. The device synchronized. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a surge of data flooded his interface, neural patterns, vast and intricate, threaded with something that felt less like thought and more like gravity. He swallowed. He did not attempt to dominate the signal. He matched it. He allowed his own neural rhythms to surface, messy, human, uneven. He thought of Earth's oceans, chaotic and magnificent. He thought of crowded cities rebuilding after storms. He thought of loneliness and of the stubborn human instinct to reach across it anyway. He spoke not in formulas, but in memory. You once asked me what binds my species together, he murmured. It isn't efficiency, it isn't elegance, it's the refusal to let one another drift alone. The lattice responded with a faint pulse. Counselors leaned forward. Elias felt resistance, an immense, weary pressure. The Queen's field was contracting inward, conserving itself. He adjusted the interface, amplifying Reciprocity rather than output. You do not have to carry this alone, he said. Softly, even stars exist in clusters. A tremor passed through the chamber. The harmonic filaments brightened by a fraction. Vyerth gasped. The amplitude. It is stabilizing, the technologist whispered. Inside the lattice, Alethra's long ear twitched. It was a small movement, almost dismissible. But Elias felt the shift like a door opening in a sealed room. Her neural pattern brushed against his cautious assessing. Not fragile but exhausted, he smiled, despite the strain pressing behind his eyes. Hello, he said. I realize this is unconventional. If it helps, I am also uncomfortable. A flicker of something, curiosity, amusement moved through the shared field. The planetary resonance, once erratic, began to align in subtle increments. The chamber lights steadied. Elias continued, voice quieter now. You built an empire that never learned how to support you. That isn't strength. That's architecture in need of revision. Another pulse, stronger. Beyond the capital, the orbital mirrors corrected their drift. The false sunrise faded. Real dawn resumed its patient climb. The strain intensified. Elias' knees threatened negotiation. I should mention, he muttered, that if I collapse, please record that I had a reasonably good final speech. Several counselors exchanged baffled glances as the lattice flared brighter. Within the crystal, Alethia's eyes opened. They were clear, focused, very much alive. Her gaze found him through layers of refracted light. For a heartbeat that felt stretched across galaxies, they remained suspended. In shared resonance, he sensed her awareness expand outward, re-establishing the planetary bond, not as solitary burden but as dynamic exchange. Her long ears lifted slowly from her hair. The harmonic filaments surged with renewed brilliance. Data stream stabilized across every monitoring array. Deep beneath the crust, tectonic tensions eased. Elias exhaled shakily. Well, he murmured, that's encouraging. The queen's lips curved. Not broadly, not ceremonially, but with unmistakable amusement. The council stood frozen between disbelief and relief. Alethia's voice, though faint, carried through the lattice. You are unexpectedly persistent. Elias blinked. Your Majesty, he replied, humans specialize in surviving situations they were never qualified to enter. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the chamber, tentative at first, then genuine. The empire had prepared for collapse. Instead, it witnessed recalibration. And as the planetary core resumed its steady song, the bond between queen and world no longer sounded solitary. It carried, woven within it, the faint but resilient echo of a second voice, refusing to let her fade alone. By the third planetary rotation after her awakening, the empire had transitioned from morning rehearsals to political panic, which in Ilya's experience was far louder. Queen Althuria no longer floated within the harmonic lattice. She stood. The act of standing should not have carried symbolic weight, yet when she stepped onto the resonance floor unaided, tremor of collective disbelief moved through the chamber. Her purple skin had regained its luminous depth, and her long ears, once motionless against her blonde hair, now shifted with precise attention, angling toward every whisper, every breath that tried and failed to remain discreet. The planetary monitors displayed stable synchronization. Oceanic tides obeyed their moons again. The orbital defense arrays rotated with disciplined grace rather than existential confusion. The world was no longer unraveling. Unfortunately, the government was. Ilias had been instructed to remain available for consultative presence, which meant standing near enough to be blamed but far enough not to be respected. He occupied a position slightly behind the primary council arc, attempting to look like someone who understood ceremonial posture. Councillor Mailer rose first. Your Majesty, he began carefully, while your recovery is celebrated, the mechanisms of that recovery require examination. Althuria's gaze drifted toward him, one ear angled forward, the other subtly toward Ilias. Examination, she repeated. Clarification, Mailer amended quickly. The Empire's stability depends upon predictability. Predictability, Ilias muttered under his breath, is a charming myth. Unfortunately, Althuria heard him. Her ear twitched. Ambassador Mar, she said evenly, would you prefer instability? He straightened. Not at all. I merely observe that the universe rarely consults our preference. A faint ripple passed through the chamber. It was not quite laughter, it was the memory of laughter attempting to reassert itself. Vyerth stepped forward. The human intervention introduced an external neural harmonic into the sovereign bond that has never occurred in recorded history. Then history has been limited, Althea replied. Silence followed that statement like a well-trained guard. Ilias felt the familiar pressure of scrutiny settle over him. He resisted the urge to check whether his device was still attached to his wrist, as if someone might accuse him of secretly orchestrating gravity. The bond did not fracture, Mailer continued, but it has altered. Our readings show dual-layer resonance patterns. Yes, Althea said calmly. It is no longer solitary. The word lingered. Ilias cleared his throat. With respect, the data suggests the planetary field benefits from adaptive reciprocity. It's less monarchical, more collaborative. Vyerth echoed as though he had suggested inviting asteroids to vote. Althea descended the final step of the resonance floor. She did not rush. She never rushed. The chamber adjusted itself to her pace. For centuries, she said, we have interpreted strength as singularity, one sovereign, one bond, one axis of stability, and when that axis faltered, we discovered how fragile singularity can be. Her eyes shifted toward Ilias again. The human did not overpower the bond, he responded to it. Ilias offered a small nod. It's a reflex. We respond to distress. Sometimes poorly, often loudly, but persistently. A junior counselor leaned toward another and whispered, not nearly softly enough. Is persistence a military asset? Ilias turned his head slightly. On Earth, it's how we assemble furniture. The whispering stopped. A reluctant smile surfaced somewhere in the second row. The tension in the chamber did not vanish, it thinned. Althea extended her hand. The harmonic interface activated above her palm, projecting a layered model of the planetary core. Within it, two distinct resonant signatures intertwined, hers and the faint echo of Ilias. As gasps were no longer subtle. This does not diminish sovereignty, she continued. It expands it. Mailer's ears angled in careful skepticism. Your Majesty, if humans can interface with the sovereign bond, they cannot, she interrupted gently, not as We do, Ambassador Mar did not claim. He supported it. Elias lifted a hand slightly. For the record, I have no interest in planetary management. I struggle with indoor plants. A quiet laugh broke free clear this time. It startled even those who produced it. Althea allowed the moment to breathe. Fear, she said softly, is understandable. Change rarely arrives. Politely, she stepped closer to Elias. The movement was subtle but seismic in implication. Her long ear brushed lightly against his shoulder, an unmistakable gesture of acknowledgement. In her culture, the chamber collectively forgot how to inhale. Ambassador Mar, she said, will you demonstrate the interface? He blinked. In front of everyone? Yes, that seems ambitious. Her expression did not shift, but her eyes carried unmistakable amusement. He activated the device. The smaller lattice unfolded, aligning once more with her field. The projection above her palm adjusted, responding not to dominance but to synchrony. This is not control, Elias said, addressing the council as much as the model. It's feedback. Think of it as conversation. Planets do not converse, Vyarth said. They do. Althea replied, we have simply been poor listeners. The resonance pattern brightened slightly, demonstrating stability without strain. No alarms triggered, no tectonic warnings flared. Across the monitors, Mailer studied the readings. The amplitude variance has decreased. Yes, Elias said, because it's shared. The word settled differently this time, not as threat but as possibility. Althea deactivated the projection, effective immediately. She announced a joint research council will be established. Human and Imperial scientists will study adaptive resonance theory. A wave of unease rippled outward. Furthermore, she continued, human advisors will be granted observational status in planetary stabilization deliberations. Vyarth's composure faltered. Your Majesty, that is unprecedented. So was my near death. That ended the objection. Elias leaned slightly toward her. I appreciate the confidence, he murmured. I also appreciate not being executed. Her ear angled toward him. Again, your survival remains strategically advantageous. Comforting, he said. The chamber began to shift, not physically but psychologically. The miracle could no longer be dismissed as anomaly. It required integration. A projection ignited along the far wall. Incoming data from the northern hemisphere. Minor atmospheric disturbance had formed during the Queen's illness and had not yet fully dissipated. Mailer turned sharply. Residual instability. Elias glanced at the readings. It's not escalating yet, Vyarth added. Althea closed her eyes briefly. The resonance field responded, but this time it did not strain. Elias felt the faint echo of her harmonic shift through his interface. Not invasive, not overwhelming, present. He adjusted the feedback loop gently. The atmospheric disturbance began to settle. Mailer stared. You did not initiate that correction alone. No. Althea said, I did not. The admission was quiet. It reverberated louder than any proclamation. The disturbance dissipated entirely. Silence returned. But it felt different now, less brittle. Elias deactivated the device. Your Majesty, he said softly, with respect. The Empire may require time. Time, she replied, is something we nearly lost. He nodded. Then perhaps we should use it well. She regarded him For a long moment, you were underestimated, she said. He offered. Faint smile, that is a common human hobby. Her lips curved in response. Across the chamber, counselors recalibrated their understanding of power. Not all were convinced. Some would resist, some would attempt to reassert the comfort of singular authority, but the data did not lie. The planet responded to shared resonance. As the session adjourned, murmurs replaced rigid silence. Questions emerged, not accusations but inquiries. Scientists requested access to Elia's interface schematics, cultural liaisons proposed structured exchanges rather than ceremonial pleasantries. The empire had not transformed in a single morning. Empires rarely do. But as Elithra and Ilias walked side by side through the corridor beyond the chamber, the planetary hum beneath their feet felt steady, not because it relied on one consciousness, but because it no longer demanded isolation. You realize, Ilias said quietly, that I will now be blamed for every minor fluctuation. Yes, she replied. Serenely, you will, he sighed. On Earth, this is what we call job security. Her laughter echoed down the corridor, clear, resonant, alive, and somewhere deep within the planet's core, the harmonic field adjusted again, not in desperation, but in adaptation, as if the world itself were learning that survival did not require solitude. The first protest was polite. It arrived as a formal petition, encoded in impeccable legal syntax and transmitted directly to the sovereign archive. It argued, with dignified alarm, that planetary resonance should not become a collaborative experiment influenced by species lacking ancestral bond right. It avoided the word human as though it were contagious. Ilias read it twice and looked up from the projection. I appreciate that they called me an influence rather than a contamination. Queen Elithra's long ear tilted toward him as she stood before the resonance window, feeling the steady pulse of the planet beneath her consciousness. They are adapting, she said. Fear prefers sophisticated vocabulary. On Earth we usually just shout. That is inefficient. It is, he agreed, but it saves time. The Joint Research Council had been operating for 6 cycles. Human scientists worked beside imperial symbiotes, mapping the dual layer resonance that now sustained the world. The data no longer suggested anomaly, it suggested improvement. Seismic volatility had decreased by 8%. Atmospheric correction response time had shortened. Even the orbital mirrors seemed less inclined toward dramatic reinterpretations of sunrise. Progress, however, is rarely unanimous. Counselor Vyarth requested an emergency convocation. Her tone was calm, which meant trouble. When the chamber assembled, the atmosphere felt sharper than before, not panicked, controlled. Different kind of tension. Your Majesty, Vyarth began, a faction within the outer provinces has initiated an independent stabilization array. They claim the sovereign bond has been compromised by external influence. Compromised, Ilias repeated softly. That's a bold word for improved. Elthiera did not smile. The array, it is untested, Mailer said. If activated, it will attempt to override the planetary core with artificial harmonics. Ilias felt the implications settle heavily. That could fracture the resonance. Yes, Elthiera said. Quietly, it could. Silence held the chamber in careful suspension. For Clarity, Elias ventured. This is the part where we prevent civil engineering from becoming planetary demolition. No one laughed this time. Altheira's eyes closed briefly as she reached into the planetary field. It responded. Steady, resilient, but she felt the tremor of the unauthorized array. Aligning in the distance, it's synthetic. Frequency clumsy and forceful. They act from fear, she said. They believe they are protecting the Empire. By destabilizing it, Elias muttered. Veer's ears angled forward. Your Majesty, if their array activates the dual resonance may be interpreted as interference. They may accuse the human. Of course they will, Elias said. It's traditional. Althea turned toward him. You may withdraw from the resonance. Until this is resolved, he blinked. Withdraw to protect you, he hesitated. The offer was genuine, so was the risk. With respect, he said carefully, if I withdraw now, their narrative becomes truth. They will say the bond was fragile, that it required secrecy. Her gaze searched his face. And if you remain, then we remained, he replied. Publicly. A faint shift passed through her expression, not amusement this time, but recognition. You have changed, she said softly. So have you, he answered. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging both statements. The unauthorized array activated sooner than expected. The first surge struck like discordant thunder through the planetary field. Monitors flared. The resonance floor vibrated beneath their feet. Mailer swore under his breath. Elias' interface lit with chaotic readings. They're forcing amplitude without feedback, he said. It's brute synchronization. The chamber lights flickered. Althea stepped forward, her purple skin luminous with rising harmonic intensity. Her long ears angled sharply, focusing. She reached into the planetary core, and this time she did not reach alone. Elias activated his device without waiting for permission. The dual layer resonance surged in response, not defensive but adaptive. The artificial array attempted to impose a rigid frequency. The planet rejected it, not violently but intelligently, adjusting around it like water reshaping around stone. They're increasing output. Vyerth warned. Of course they are. Elias muttered. When in doubt, add volume. The tremor intensified. Crystalline structures along the chamber walls began to hum. Althea's voice cut through the noise. Open a channel to the outer provinces. Mailer hesitated. Only a moment before complying, the projection ignited. Provincial leaders appeared stern, resolute. You in danger. The Empire, one declared. No, Althea replied evenly. You endanger it by refusing to evolve. The sovereign bond is sacred. It remains so, she said. Sacred does not mean stagnant. Another surge rippled through the field. Elias felt the strain press against his thoughts. He leaned toward the projection. If I may, your array is destabilizing tectonic equilibrium in 3 sectors. If you continue, you will fracture the crust you claim to defend. You are human, the leader snapped. Yes, Elias said, and currently preventing your planet from cracking. Althea did not silence him. Instead, she stepped closer to the projection. You fear delusion, she said calmly. You fear that shared resonance diminishes us. Look at the data, she signaled. The Research Council, real-time metrics streamed across the chamber and into the provincial feed. Reduced volatility, enhanced stabilization, improved Recovery intervals. This is not corruption, she continued. It is growth, the unauthorized array. Wavered, Elias felt the shift instantly. They're hesitating, he murmured. Final surge spiked, then faltered. The artificial harmonics destabilized under their own rigidity, without adaptive feedback the system could not sustain. Coherence, it shut down abruptly. Tremor ceased across the chamber. Instruments recalibrated, the planetary field settled stronger than before. Silence fell heavy and profound. The provincial leaders remained on the projection, their defiance replaced by uneasy contemplation. You see, Althuria said gently, strength does not reside in isolation. It resides in connection. The feed terminated without further argument. Elias deactivated his device. Slowly, well, he said, exhaling, that was moderately apocalyptic, this time. Laughter came, relieved, genuine. Unstoppable, Virek lowered her gaze. Your Majesty, she said quietly. Data is conclusive. Mailer inclined his head. The bond has not weakened, it has matured, Althuria replied. In the cycles that followed, the outer provinces rescinded their opposition. Not instantly, not enthusiastically, but decisively. The unauthorized array was dismantled and integrated into the joint research program as a cautionary case study. Titled The Perils of Excessive Confidence, human advisors were granted full participatory status within the Stabilization Council. Educational reforms reframed the sovereign bond as a living system rather than a solitary inheritance. And at the heart of it all stood a queen who no longer bore her world alone. One evening, beneath the steady glow of the orbital rings, Althuria and Elias stood on the upper terrace. The Empire will remember this as a crisis, she said. Empires like dramatic vocabulary, Elias replied. She glanced at him, one long ear brushing lightly against his shoulder in familiar acknowledgement. And you, he considered the question. I arrived here trying to prove that humans were useful, he said slowly. I think I learned that usefulness isn't the point. What is belonging? He answered, not as guests, not as saviors, as participants. She studied him for a long moment. You no longer doubt your place, he smiled faintly. I still doubt everything, I'm just less afraid of it. Althuia's gaze lifted toward the rings, then back to him. When I fell ill, she said, I believed my failure would define my reign. I see now that my willingness to accept aid defines it instead. That's inconveniently wise, he said. I have had practice. The planetary hum beneath felt different now, not louder, not brighter, but layered, shared. You realize, Elias added, that future historians will oversimplify this terribly. They always do. They'll say the humans saved the queen. She shook her head gently. No, they will say the queen chose to change. He looked at her, surprised. And they will be correct, she said. Below them the capital thrived, its transit lanes luminous, its towers resonant with steady energy. The world did not tremble, the mirrors did not misbehave. The oceans obeyed their tides. The empire had not collapsed, it had adjusted. Althuia extended her hand. Elias hesitated only briefly before taking it, not ceremonially, not politically, but simply for a moment. The planetary